In a 1972 interview, the Ojibwa artist Patrick DesJarlait describes the earliest memories informing his art practice. DesJarlait, like many Indigenous children born in the 1920s, spent much of his childhood in residential schools. Those memories, however, are not foregrounded in his telling of his life story. The artist's life is instead framed by the tactile memories of his childhood on the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. Many of these memories center around seasonal harvests from his early years. DesJarlait's art practice, grounded in his depictions of Ojibwe people engaged in cooperative, seasonal labor, begins in the maple sugar camps he spent time at as a child. DesJarlait recalls being invited to sketch his relatives as they harvested and processed maple sap into syrup and crystallized sugar. Throughout his life, DesJarlait created watercolor paintings inspired by his childhood memories of Red Lake. The artist's son, a fellow artist, described his father's belief that, quote, native art conveys a tribe and a culture, unquote, above all else. Many of the scenes DesJarlait selected to convey these ideas are those of communal labor. His sturdy figures in contemporary dress, depicted with strong, curving limbs, appear fishing, weaving baskets, harvesting manumin or wild rice, and processing maple sap. The artist's lived experiences intersect with traditional knowledge and the ever-evolving continuation of practices specific to the Ojibwe, many involving traditional foods. Though DesJarlait himself worried the practices he recorded would soon disappear, his paintings reveal the transmotion and survivance of Ojibwe life. His harvest scenes show practices present across centuries and into the current moment, always transforming alongside the harvesters themselves to evade and resist the ongoing process of colonization. In Maple Sugar Time, DesJarlait depicts sovereign practices specific to Ojibwa ways of being. DesJarlait's painting reveals the continuity and transformations embedded within by showing Ojibwe figures in contemporary dress painted in abstracted style, engaged in traditional relationships with sugar maples. The practice painted in Maple Sugar Time shows relationships between the Ojibwe figures, a plant endemic to the Great Lakes region, and the traditional foodstuffs produced in the interaction between the two. The gathering of maple sap exists in relation to ideas of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty possesses various definitions, with some performing more meaningful work than others. Journalist Raj Patel defines food sovereignty through its crucial differences from the liberal idea of food security. For Patel, food sovereignty is, quote, a call for the right of everyone to be able actively to shape the food system rather than being shaped by it, a call for a democratic debate and action around food and about redistributing power more equitably in the food system, unquote. Food sovereignty is more than simply ensuring everyone has something to eat. It instead provides a space for radical interventions and changes to fundamentally reshape relationships between food and people. Food sovereignty may be expressed in ways particular to Indigenous food systems. The Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance describes the restoration of Indigenous food systems as a, quote, immediate and fundamental need, unquote, for the survival and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous Food Systems Network, an organization operating in Canada, outlines key points for Indigenous food sovereignty: acknowledging food as sacred and thereby not able to be constrained by colonial laws, maintaining cultural harvesting strategies, emphasizing self-determination by tribes, and attempting to reconcile Indigenous foodways with colonial laws. The harvesting of maple sap in the past, present, and during DesJarlait's lifetime all relate to ideas of food sovereignty, which I address in relation to transmotion. Transmotion, as coined by Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner, moves alongside his concept of survivance. Survivance is, for our purposes, defined as the continued presence of Indigenous people and the inextricable combination of survival, resistance, and resilience embedded in Indigenous existence. The related term, transmotion, must be further defined. Visner's Fugitive Poses, Native American Indian Scenes of Presence and Absence, describes transmotion as a, quote, sense of native motion and an active presence, a reciprocal use of nature, not a monotheistic territorial sovereignty, unquote. Transmotion, for Visner, is a form of sovereignty outside the realm of treaty rights. Transmotion places sovereignty as a state of mind and heart rather than something reflected in law. It cannot, therefore, be limited by colonial governments. Though the issues of sovereignty related to DesJarlait's work include those related to treaty sovereignty, this alternative avenue is equally important. For Visner and other scholars, transmotion is especially visible in storytelling. Art historian Bill Anthes states that DesJarlait viewed his art as an extension of storytelling traditions, but also felt urgency towards preserving ways of life he thought were vanishing. Perhaps unknowingly, the artist's paintings function on another level, one of evidencing transmotion. In describing traditional food practices into his watercolor paintings, Maple Sugar Time, DesJarlait reveals survivance in these practices rather than spaces where a vanishing tradition must be preserved for posterity. DesJarlait painted Maple Sugar Time during a return to Red Lake. He describes that year as a time wherein he strove to define his art style and to observe and record all that he could about his people and their cultural practices. Maple Sugar Time reveals the achievement of both of these aims. Here, the artist depicts 5 Ojibwe figures engaged in different steps of processing a culturally significant food. Maple sap has been harvested by the Anishinaabe for centuries. This is acknowledged even in the ideologically fraught Western field of archaeology, with sugar bushes in northern Michigan and Wisconsin described in archaeological publications as dating to at least the 1700s. The 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs and the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw include articles that ostensibly preserve the rights of Indigenous peoples to continue harvesting from maple trees. The importance of maple sap is further emphasized by Lake Mille Lacs Ojibwe elder Larry Amick Smallwood's statement that it should be, quote, treated with respect. If you burn some, if you spill it, if you waste any unintentionally, you got to do a little tobacco ceremony for that, unquote. Maple sugaring, like many of the other traditional harvests recalled by DesJarlait, is innately ephemeral in its tie to seasonality, but also an ever-renewing signal of a shift to spring. The figures of Maple Sugar Time are grounded in a sense of time dictated by the season. The men wear hats, and all of the figures are shown wearing coats or jackets to ward off the chill of a northern Minnesota spring. DesJarlait's memories of maple sugaring are colored by the excitement of a child looking forward to maple cakes, but also by that innate ephemerality of the harvest. Upon the end of the harvest, some families would try to sell maple products in the nearby city of Bemidji. The sale of maple syrup is a complex issue. Armin Garnet Rufo notes in acknowledging the impossible that maple syrup originated with Indigenous communities and was, quote, part and parcel of an Indigenous economy, unquote. The syrup is ubiquitous in Canadian and United States kitchens, while its origins in Indigenous communities are obscured and the industry remains dominated by non-Indigenous farmers and companies. This is not to argue, however, that treating maple syrup as a product is the only route by which maple sap is intertwined with ideas of Anishinaabe sovereignty. As stated previously, it appears in early 19th century treaties and has been encompassed by later rulings in relation to hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. Maple Sugar Time reveals the transmotion visible in the continued practices of harvesting maple sap every spring. The figures are unified with their forest background. Gray and blue toned tree trunks match the color of jackets and head wraps. Trees occupy the entirety of the background and frame the painting. The trees are themselves as much a part of the process of maple sugaring as the people working over kettles, pails, and troughs. This traditional harvesting of maple sap is not static in DesJarlait's depiction. Transmotion is embodied in the inalienable contemporality of the figures, but also in the iron kettles. These are innovative additions to the process of maple sugaring that were quickly adopted by the Anishinaabe. DesJarlait shows the ever-transforming potential of Ojibwe traditions by painting both a traditional birch bark basket and the syrup harvesting bucket. While the bucket exists fully formed, the basket is in the process of being made. It is not an artifact, but an object created in the moment of the painting. The basket, like the figure forming it, is inalienable from the present. Maple Sugar Time represents quintessential elements of DesJarlait's career. The majority of his body of work consists of depictions of contemporary Ojibwe figures engaged in traditional, yet distinctly modern, iterations of communal labor. They are each painted in this abstracted and curvilinear style. These artworks are inseparable from his own memories and lived experiences as a member of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa. They contribute to a visual expression of the survivance of Ojibwe people. The capacity for change in the name of survivance is ever present, even as DesJarlait feared he was working against time itself to record what he thought might vanish. Instead, he recorded testimonies to the opposite, revealing a cultural resiliency embedded in food traditions that link past, present, and future. Thank you.